Next on Investigative Report. Murder Capital USA. The shifting states of death in America. Her shimmering arch soars to 660 feet above the Mississippi, a full 75 feet higher than a U.S. monument in Washington, D.C. Here at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, the city conceived as the gateway to the West has recently added a new name to the town's moniker, that being Murder Capital USA. This unwanted distinction is granted annually to the city in America that exceeds the highest number of murders per 100,000 persons. But St. Louis was not always feared this way. Busch Stadium and other downtown venues welcomed tourists and residents alike day and night. That is, until the pandemic, which once reduced exposure, began to birth crime. And now, Murder Capital USA, the shifting states of death in America. The peace and relative security that prevailed throughout the previous year in St. Louis and the Show Me State would be shattered with an announcement halfway across the globe. On January 10, 2020, the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, would announce that the outbreak in Wuhan, China, was caused by the 2019 novel coronavirus. As a precaution, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the Center for Disease Control, would publish information about the 2019 novel coronavirus and give a press conference beside the President of the United States. January 14, 2020, as the world began to deteriorate further down the infectious rabbit hole, the World Health Organization would find possible evidence of human-to-human transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. World Health Organization scientists say that human-to-human transmission is not surprising given our knowledge of respiratory pathogens. The next guidance coming out of the World Health Organization would lead citizens to challenge the laws of governance over bodily autonomy, their right to free speech, and the right to either wear or go without a face covering. All these stressors would play a part in the increased violence that would plague St. Louis for one full year, although officials would try to lay blame at the foot of the economy for the increased sales of arms and the easy access to illegal weapons purchases. These safety and security worries in an environment where people were starting to feel every man for himself mentality would ignite an unquenchable violent trend. You had situations where mothers could not get their funds to feed their children, and gross management of government directives in which people were either furloughed, fired, or put on hold for their jobs. It would seem that the pandemic had widened a schism that had already grown between the middle class and the wealthy, and those who were barely getting by against everyone else. Businesses from convenience stores to fast food were being robbed and looted, and theft of personal property would increase precipitously. People would be threatened with losing their homes for lack of payment, and children would be forced out of schools because there were no caregivers to watch them. All of these ingredients would spark a powder keg of unwarranted violence in the Arch City that would not abate until the return of freedoms the following year. On March 15, 2020, the United States would not be so united with its plans to implement a shutdown, with the then President Donald Trump left up to the governors in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. By then, police precincts all across St. Louis had already begun to report the grumblings of a full-fledged revolt based upon curtailed freedoms and the absence of basic necessities. Officers reported that they could see that old patterns of crime no longer fit the COVID mold, where typically crimes were committed more by day and murders mainly by night. The lines blurred with historic data sets. Back in the Missouri State House, Governor Mike Parsons issued a statewide stay-at-home Missouri order effective beginning at 12:01 a.m. on Monday, April 6, 2020, until midnight on Friday, April 24th of that same year. Governor Parsons, like many other state executives across America, extended his own stay-at-home order through May 3rd of that year. By that time, the murder rate was just beginning to blossom. On May 25, 2020, the gas would be added to the fires of people's frustrations with their elected officials when George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, was murdered by a white police officer in Minnesota. This igniting nationwide protests against police brutality, and exploding a powder keg of pent-up emotions and frustrations of a nation that was tired of government officials controlling their every move. It was at this point that anything could have set off the violence, even if Floyd had not been murdered or the Black Lives Matter had never been invented. Many citizens, dissatisfied with the response time of police and a lawless pandemic, had begun to purchase guns en masse. Others at the time were making protests to either abolish or defund the police. Some cities voted along with these bodies, but the vast majority of Americans opposed getting rid of police departments. During that bloody year in St. Louis and around the U.S., gun purchases accelerated during 2020 and 2021 compared to 2019, with more than 5 million adults becoming first-time gun owners between the height of the pandemic in January of 2020 and April 2021, compared to 2.4 million adults in the previous year, 2019. Political powers would shift at the state and national levels as citizens felt their elected officials did not know what they were doing at the most critical hour of their leadership. Donald Karifoff, the Missouri Director of Health, and a growing number of local and state health officials across the United States will resign, retire, or been fired over backlash against masks and vaccines as a way to prevent the spread of COVID-19. None too soon to allay public fear and calm the violence would see the first ray of light amidst a storm of uncertainty. On May 1, 2020, the FDA issued an emergency use authorization for the use of antiviral drug remdesivir for the treatment of suspected or confirmed COVID-19 in people who are hospitalized with a severe disease. A month before, on April 27, 2020, Governor Parsons announced his first wave of the Show Me Strong Recovery Plan to begin on May 4th, under which the states started reopening economically and social activity. There would be no limitations on social gatherings as long as 6 feet of distance can be maintained between individuals. All businesses will be able to reopen as long as 6 feet of social distancing can be maintained. Indoor retail businesses would also have to limit their numbers of customers to no more than 25% of normal capacity. Local communities would be allowed to have stricter rules if they chose. Many states would choose to prolong their lockdown orders, which would leave different states' residents wondering why the White House wouldn't take control over states' rights in order to inform and uniform the COVID recovery. States that lifted their stay-at-home orders first were the states that would see an immediate decrease in violence and gun deaths. At the height of the pandemic, St. Louis saw a 34% increase in homicides for just a year before. Now that we sit 2 years after the pandemic, and it's in the rearview mirror, St. Louis now has less of a murder rate than they did half a decade ago. Indeed, there is something to be said of what happens next time we have a national or international emergency that causes economic distress and social isolation. How will we behave? And will we have learned any lesson from the pandemic even now as New Orleans transitions into the murder capital of the U.S. for the year 2022? And for them, they have no national emergency or bad economy.